Hello, I'm Jay Hirsch, Director of Administration for Columbia's ERM program. I'd like to invite you to tonight's ERM panel, Conduct Risk, the Consequences of Bad Behavior. And now for opening remarks, here is Dave Romoff, Associate Director and Lecturer in Discipline of Columbia's ERM program. Dave?
Thanks, Jay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation. Panels are a major part of our program. We hold about 8 of them each year, and they're great opportunities to take the material that we learn in class and see how it comes to life. Today's topic, as you know, is conduct risk, and our flyer asks the questions: what makes things go wrong at an organization? What emboldens managers to help themselves before their company? What makes salespersons sell without concern to the customer? Today, we're lucky to have our moderator, Penny Cagan, lead us through questions like this. Currently, Penny is head of operational risk governance at MUFG Union Bank. She manages their operational risk framework, practices, and regulatory responses. Penny has received 3 awards for her contributions to the field of operational risk and regulatory from the Operational Risk and Regulation magazine. She sits on the board of Primia. We're lucky to have her teaching our operational risk management class, and she's used her 30+ years of experience in the field to assemble today's talented and accomplished panelists. So without further delay, I'll pass it over to Penny. Penny, the podium's yours.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here, and good evening everybody. And conduct risk is a topic that is very, very dear to my heart. Conduct risk is inherent in many of the large events we have experienced in the recent past and is an important component in managing risk in a variety of industries and institutions. There's no official definition of conduct risk, but I like to define it as doing the right thing by your customers, your employees, your stakeholders, your shareholders. I've put together what I call a dream panel. It's a panel of industry experts who are people I highly respect. I'd like to ask the panel in a minute to start with introductions and with their own definition of operational risk. Among the panelists, we have representatives from a global bank, a professional service firm, a technology company. 3 of our panelists are actually former regulators who have provided significant input into global conduct and risk guidance. So I'm going to start by asking first Tanya to introduce herself, then Scott, then Spiro, and then Tom, and also tell us what your definition of conduct risk is, and then we'll launch into the question. So Tanya, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, Penny. Tanya Weissletter. I'm the Global Head of Conduct Risk at Karetsos. I have 25 years of experience in banking and the finance industry. Most recently, I've been in the conduct space for 5 or 6 years now. The way I would define conduct risk is really the misbehavior or poor judgment of employees that could negatively, financially, non-financial, reputationally impact employees, the bank, our clients, and potentially have knock-on effects to the markets. This definition is, as Penny mentioned, I think industry standard at least in the finance and banking space.
Thank you, Tanya. Scott, I'd like to go over to you. Scott Waterhouse.
Sure. Hi, good evening, everyone. It's Scott Waterhouse. I am a managing director at Ernst & Young, as it says on the screen there. And I've been at Ernst & Young for about 5 years. I work in the financial services sector, and I advise clients on any number of risk and regulatory matters. And the regulatory nexus there is before EY, I spent over 30 years at the OCC. So I'm a career bank examiner. I'm a recovering bank examiner now, as I would say. But much of my time at the OCC was devoted to large bank supervision. I was the examiner in charge of 2 mega banks, one for the 5 years before the financial crisis, and the second was right through the financial crisis, 5 years through the financial crisis. So I spent a lot of time there. I do want to have a little qualifier there that any comments I have and in particular, any opinions that I express. Any of my own opinions are my own opinions. So I don't want any, this doesn't, I don't want to taint EY, I don't want to taint the OCC. So anything I say is gonna be for me. So I would concur with both Penny and Tanya on how they characterize conduct risk. It's really the act, or conduct is the activity of employees and officers and directors of the bank that have an impact on the firm itself, the clients, and other stakeholders. So conduct risk would be taking that conduct and doing it poorly, having not serving your clients, not serving your customers, not serving your community in a proper way. There is no, in the US, Tom will talk about it in a minute, in the US, there is not a common uniform definition in the regulatory community about it. But what the regulators have pretty much done is had the bank, each bank define it for themselves. And as we'll talk about today, that definition has an impact on how they actually think through it, how they communicate it, and how they actually manage it on a day-to-day basis throughout the company. So anyway, I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Scott. Spiro, why don't we go to you next?
Thanks, Penny. Great to be here and with you and the panel. Next time, let's do it in person.
Yes.
But you know, my history is over 20 years in financial services, first decade with the Federal Reserve. So I think I like to say I'm classically trained in risk management and compliance, and then practically trained as I moved to Goldman Sachs there during the financial crisis. Ultimately moved to Vanguard and SunTrust, was the chief risk officer of TD Ameritrade, and now I'm almost 2 months in at Google. So very excited to change industries, and of course, everything that I'm sharing today, just like Scott said, is based on my experiences and my opinion and based on my work with the industry, not representing any specific entity this evening. As I think about conduct, I love that you talked about doing the right thing. For me, it comes down to 5 components of doing the right thing. It's acting with integrity, reporting your own wrongdoing, or if you see someone else's wrongdoing, dedicating yourself and your service to your stakeholders, whether they are shareholders or clients, avoiding any perceived or real conflicts of interest, and having fair and honest business practices. And a quick story on how I learned about this is when I was a young boy, I got to work in my dad's taxi cab, and I sat in the front seat, and my job on the weekends was to turn on the meter in New York City. And I once did that wrong, and I realized midway through a fare that I didn't turn on the meter correctly. I told my dad, who was the driver and the head of the taxi, so I confessed. He told the client, he offered the client a free fare as a result of my mistake, and the client paid him more than what the fare was worth due to my mistake. So that was my real life 8-year-old learning of what conduct is and what it means to have great behavior. And there were no repercussions to me after the fact for reporting my wrongdoing.
Cool. Thank you, Spiro. I love that. I grew up in my father's pharmacy. I have similar stories of dealing with customers and lessons I learned from my father. So that's perfect. Tom is our special guest from London. So Tom, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you. So my name is Tom Balogh, and I'm an executive director at A&O Consulting, where I lead our work on non-financial risk and control. Although, as with everyone else, I'm speaking personally rather than representing A&O Consulting. My background is I spent 8 years in UK regulators in both the communications and the financial services sectors, and the last 9 years as a regulatory consultant, specializing in conduct risk and sort of associated controls around those. As you can probably tell by my accent, I'm from the UK, so I'm speaking from that perspective. And while I'm not sure I can really add anything to the definitions we've already got around conduct risk, and especially Spiro's, I think from the UK perspective, we have a very broad definition of conduct risk, which is roughly speaking that any action of a regulated firm or an individual within it that leads to customer detriment or has an adverse effect on market stability or effective competition. And that really comes out of the fact that the UK Financial Conduct Regulator, called the FCA, has 3 strategic objectives, and that's to protect consumers, protect the integrity of financial markets, and to promote competition. So they have largely pushed a definition that includes all 3. But the FCA does expect all firms to have their own systems and controls, and as part of that, to create their own more bespoke definition of conduct risk that works for their business. So they try to get their cake and eat it in one sense.
Thank you, Tom. That's great. It's actually wonderful to have the UK perspective, because a lot of the conduct risk practices come out of the UK regime. So very much love that we have the UK perspective. So thank you. Let's go to our first question. I'm going to start with Scott for the first question, and then ask Spiro to contribute. So the first question is, what are the direct and indirect impacts of getting conduct risk wrong? And I'm going to start with you, Scott, because I know you've seen a lot of stuff in your career.
I have seen a lot of stuff. There's a lot of baggage in the closet here, but I would say that as I first thought about this question, that when you start thinking about direct versus indirect, oftentimes the 2 of them kind of intersect. That you have a direct impact can have an indirect impact, and an indirect impact can have a direct impact. But I think one of the key things, if you think about it both from a business perspective and from a personal perspective, from both, one of the initial direct impacts is a damage to your reputation, and that's one thing that is very difficult to manage in financial services. And then related corollary to that is a lack of trust. So where you see institutions that have breached the trust, breached an event, or caused something where individuals start to question whether they're behaving appropriately, that damage to reputation is huge. And I would say, looking at financial services companies, over anyone that has had a serious reputational risk issue, it has taken years and years and years to be able to recover that. And in almost all instances, it's had to come, and we'll talk a little bit about culture later on, but it's come down to having to have a new CEO and a new executive management team come in to try to change the factors there. So reputation risk, I would say, from financial services, is very important to guard that as much as you can, and know that once it's damaged, it's very hard to get back. From a regulatory perspective, pulling out my OCC hat on this, the regulators are all over this right now, and they will do all sorts of, or provide all sorts of actions against banks and individuals where they see reputational damage. So you'll see informal matters requiring attention, but once those things, once issues become much more ingrained in the company, regulators will go with formal actions. They'll do some type of written agreement or cease and desist, where they actually outline in a legal document things that the banks have to do to fix that. Those things are very, very difficult to manage. They're very difficult to get out of. And you're at a point, as an institution, you're at a point where you're actually having the regulator telling you how to run the bank.
Yep.
And again, that's very difficult. On the other side, personally, individuals can be fined for misconduct. That's a very tangible element there. And as well, and this happens all the time, you may not be aware, but happens all the time, where individuals are actually kicked out of banking. The regulators actually sign documents and present them to the doctor that says, thanks, but no thanks. You're no longer welcome in financial services. Go work in another profession. So that can be, it can be very tangible that way, both in terms of civil money penalties against the banks, civil money penalties against individuals, formal agreements against banks, and removal from the industry for individuals. Those are big. Kind of on the indirect side, I would just throw out a couple items. When you have misconduct, think about, and part of this comes back to culture as well, but you get low morale and heightened turnover at institutions. It's very hard to maintain a sustainable climate where you're actually trying to do the right things. There's insufficient or ineffective workforce. There's customer dissatisfaction when you're not able to achieve the strategic objectives of the institution. To be able to try to do that, to be able to have your entire workforce trying to accomplish the same objectives. And I would say there can be this group think where you have this issue where people start thinking that that the culture here is that you can get away with stuff, you don't have to do it, you can cut corners, you can do this, you can do that. And at the end of the day, that all adds up to a very corrosive environment. So whether that's direct or indirect, I don't know, but in both cases, through that, it can lead to very bad outcomes for the institution.
Thank you. Thank you. And you know what's interesting? Well, the challenge in conduct risk is that one person can put a whole organization at risk in terms of the reputation. You know, every person is important in terms of their behavior and their conduct.
Yep.
That's great. Thank you. Spiro, can I turn it to you?
Sure, thanks, Penny. Scott and I were definitely trained at the same school. So I don't want to be redundant and layer in, because as I was thinking about this, everything that Scott said was on my cost of getting it wrong. So what I'll do is I'll take the other side of the equation. I'll take the positives of getting it right.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. And in doing so, I'm going to use the same consequence categories that Scott used. So typically when you're looking at negative events, you're looking at the consequences of financial loss, negative reputation, and regulatory impact. So let's flip those. So let's talk about gain on the P&L side. Let's talk about positive reputation, even from a market cap perspective. And let's talk about regulatory white knights in the industry and how that feels. So first of all, there is a consensus and history and statistics to prove that companies that do the right thing can be very profitable, right? It's not contrary to focus on financial performance and doing the right thing. It's actually extremely complementary. And in doing so, you create long-term client value because your clients and your stakeholders are who you put first. And when you put those clients first, they stick with you. And not only do they stick with you, they refer you. So your clients sell you and you don't have to sell you, right? Which is a tremendous referral network that gets created. And then your employees are highly engaged. I think Scott referenced that, right? So they can be disengaged when bad conduct happens at a company and want to leave. They are highly engaged and they attract talent. So talent attracts talent. And at the end of the day, they becomes what I call a positive flywheel for the organization. And then regulators not only put you up as best practice, but they have you come speak at events, right? They share your practice with other, and then your individual practice becomes a practice that they ask others to follow in the industry. And it actually, when you're not burdened, as Scott said, with running your business to satisfy the regulators because they lose trust in you, you can actually run your business for your stakeholders, for your shareholders, for your clients. So it frees you up from a time and capacity perspective without having that regulatory burden. And then finally, I'll say we measured the Edelman Trust Barometer. So if you ever take a look at that, it has different industries and how the general public feels about you. Post-financial crisis, financial services was very low on the Edelman Trust Barometer. And if you think about that, you know, financial services is where companies put their money for their savings, for their goals, for their future, for their home, for their retirement, for their children. We want to be the most trusted, right? When I was in financial services. So if you think about the trust element of this, we really need to uplift trust, which will uplift all of the elements of financial performance and engagement, and ultimately lead to more positive outcomes.
Thank you. Thank you. And certainly agree that you want to be the bank that's leading the practice and pulling the industry with you, as opposed to being pushed to follow. So thank you. So I'm going to move to the next question. We're going to talk about best practices. So Tanya, I know you have developed a very robust conduct risk program for your institution. What do you consider the current best practices for managing conduct risk?
Sure. So it seems like we all here on this panel have very similar backgrounds in terms of compliance, operational risk management. I tend to thrive in spaces that are gray, and trying to organize the gray space and give people clear guidance. So in terms of conduct risk, it is very gray in terms of people understanding. You add the word risk to conduct and it throws people completely off. So what I tend to do is use those operational risk disciplines to try and organize the information. So really leveraging, a firm's operational risk registry, right? Conduct risk, there's a correlation to conduct in almost everything we do at our organizations and our companies. I like to think of it as a correlation to conduct. There are some things that are highly correlated to conduct, like unauthorized trading activities. And there are other operational risks that fall lower on that scale. So what I like to do is really take those operational risks or whatever a company sees within their risk register and look to organize it on a scale, on a risk scale from low to very high, right? Doing that with conduct is, I think, very important because it's what I call a horizontal to all the risks, right? And you can apply that to operational risks, to credit risk, market risk, any risks in an organization. I'm speaking more in the finance, obviously, and banking space. So, using or leveraging some of the disciplines in enterprise risk management really helps in terms of areas like conduct risk, where you're trying to educate an organization on what it actually is. Having clear definitions, I, tend to have a definition of whatever risk I'm focused on, and I look to hang my hat on it. So if it's conduct risk and you're thinking about the misbehavior or poor judgment of employees and the financial, non-financial, reputational risk to the client, the bank, the employee, and potentially the market, I look to organize all the elements around that, right? So having a conduct risk assessment, thinking about the actual financial, non-financial, reputational risk to the client, to the bank, to the employee, and potentially to the market. And then what is the potential risk for that, right? So people, I think, around a table tend to subconsciously think about the same elements of conduct. But once you put it in a standard, structured format for people to understand, organize it, and categorize the thought process, it really helps people, think about the risks. I almost think that part of my job is to help people identify the risk. Like, what is the risk? I speak to AML officers and I would ask them, so what is the risk of, onboarding a senior public figure? And they would just look at me with questions, but, what's the risk? You're just asking a basic question. And it's funny how when people are asked those basic questions, they have a hard time answering it. It's like, isn't it reputational? Like, wouldn't there be huge reputational risk if you're onboarding a private figure to, in a bank? So again, I think organizing, outlining clear guidance for people when they think about conduct risk, having clear definitions. We also leverage, and I think what's so important when organizations think about conduct, I think Scott and Spiro touched on it, is culture, right? Culture is the greatest mitigant you could have, or positive culture is the greatest mitigant you could have against conduct risk, right? So having a firm that has strong positive behavioral expectations that they actually live and embody and permeate through is key and foundational to the work we do in conduct risk.
Cool. Thank you. Tom, we'd love to get the UK perspective on best practices for managing conduct risk.
So I think Tanya's given us a pretty perfect masterclass on sort of overall how do you manage conduct risk. I suppose from a UK's perspective, there are probably some themes I can draw out, partly because the UK regulator has published 5 conduct questions that every firm has to answer and be able to answer to their regulator. So those give us a framework that we can use. And some themes I pull partly out of those and partly just I keep seeing them come up, both in FS firms, but also wider ones. Tanya touched on proactively identifying and mitigating conduct risks, but I'll highlight the proactive, I guess, sort of going out and thinking about it, trying to find what they are. The need to report on conduct, the need to get it up to a senior level. So it's important that boards and excos sort of really understand conduct issues that have emerged or the risks that are being run, and then that they take that into account in strategic decisions. It's not just enough to have a report going to exco, and it's probably not enough to just have a qualitative assessment by a risk officer. You know, really you want to try and find some metrics, but then most importantly, that they actually look at them and think about them when they're setting the strategy and sort of forward-looking side of the firm. And then there's the cultural side, which is maybe less about managing the conduct risk and more about setting the right area for it to thrive. So creating a culture where each individual, you know, both feels and is responsible for good conduct. Again, I think we said this earlier in the definition piece, but fundamentally conduct is about every individual. And then finally, positive support for employees around improving conduct. Those are themes, I guess. A couple of sort of good practices I've seen: proactively rewarding or recognizing good conduct. So not just focusing on the bad behaviors, but actually going out of your way and celebrating good behavior. Very difficult to do sometimes, but I've seen a couple of good ways. I mean, access to leaders can be a really good way to reward people. So, you know, we often talk about reward and remuneration when it comes to conduct and sort of trying to sort of incentivize people that way. I think that's great, but it can be quite hard, especially before you've got your quantitative metrics really good. But being able to give some access to leaders where you see a culture there is great. I've seen people have sort of dinners with the C-suite for those who have been identified as culture champions. I was aware of one firm that actually does a 3-day global retreat where they take everyone off to an exciting place on an annual basis for those who have been identified as great conduct sort of champions. And I always thought that was great because they get C-suite to come and talk to them. You feel like you're really being incentivized, but also people get promoted if the C-suite know about them. So you're actually giving not just sort of recognition, reward, but also you're liable to then have given a career boost to those you most want to. And one final thing, maybe just in terms of things that the UK regulator's has been talking about recently. I think we've all heard about things like tone from the top, and in recent years, tone from the middle has been a concept that people have talked about. This year, the regulator in the UK decided to come up with a totally new concept, or at least I've never heard of it before, which was tone from within, that they decided to define as a new phrase to consider when you're thinking about conduct. And that represents a sort of individual's mindset and their preferences, and making sure that each individual thinks about their own tone and sort of having good behaviors. I'm not sure I've seen yet how people are getting to manage that, but it's really going to be about sort of incentivizing self-reflection and self-challenge as a way to then drive wider corporate change, I guess.
Interesting, thank you. That's interesting, tone from within. I like that. I mean, I've thought a lot about tone from the middle and how that, you know, drives behavior, but that's interesting. Thank you. And actually, it's a good lead into our next topic, which is performance management and incentive comp. So I'd like to turn the next question to Spiro and discuss how performance management and incentive compensation drive behavior and impact conduct risk.
Sure, thanks, Penny. And just trying to piggyback off of Tom's point, that tone from within, we used to talk about tone from the top and tone from the middle, of course, and we used to talk about echo from the bottom. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Tanya remembers that. Yeah, and we would measure that through surveys and focus groups, meaning that it's okay that people talk the talk, but does everyone walk the walk? And I'm going to piggyback on you. Conduct is for all people. It's for everyone, which means that your ethical conduct program applies to all levels and all rainmakers, every single person in your organization. The moment you start granting exceptions for bad behavior is the moment that you're going to show what you're willing to tolerate. And there are degrees of influence in your organization. So those who are the most influential have to be the best role models, because they have the nodes that connect into them that create the culture of your organization. And you're right, performance management and incentive programs is the exact way you can target making sure that you're reinforcing the behaviors that you expect. And once again, I'm glad I went up to Tom, because it's not just taking away when you do bad things and have bad behavior and have conduct unbecoming of expectations. It's that you plus performance management and you plus compensation for behaviors and conduct that goes above and beyond expectations, right? In both cases, you create testimonials and you're public about it, right? So you share within your organization stories and case studies of people having superior and excellent conduct and culture and doing the right thing, even in tough situations. And when you let people go for doing the wrong thing, you're public about that as well, right? You don't hide the fact that you're doing that, because you have to show that there is consequences and people are aware of that, so it becomes a deterrent. Now, talking about the performance management system and financial services, you'll actually see ratings as you rate individuals on their culture, on their conduct, on their risk management and compliance capabilities, right? And we have to give them tool sets, managers, so that they can actually evaluate those people. So yes, they can do it qualitatively, but what metrics are we providing them to help them with those ratings, okay? And in addition, as a good auditor would say, always follow the money, right? So what you're paying for in your incentive contracts is going to influence the way people act. So look at all of your incentive contracts and ask yourself, does it create any perverse actions to achieve these outcomes? And would any of these outcomes not be enabling our shareholders or stakeholders or client expectations? So we have an audit every year. We have compliance, evaluate, design of comp programs, all to make sure that we've got the right incentives that align with our culture and our conduct of our organization.
Thanks. Thank you. I see Scott shaking his head in acknowledgement in your little cube. Do you want to?
Sure, I can offer a few things, and I guess turnabout is fair play. So I'm following Spyro here, where he followed me before, and a lot of what he said is very is perfect, I think, and a lot of it is coming from kind of the tone from the top, the tone from the middle, the echo and tone from within. I've got two new phrases here. Those last two are new to me, so that's helpful. But I would the only thing, the way I would characterize it too, I'm a little bit more basic on this. A lot of it comes down to carrots and sticks, right? So you want to be able to identify, measure, and reward good behavior. You want to identify, measure, and I would say punish bad behavior. And the thing that's important about that is that you need to be consistent across it. To Spiro's point, that it has to be everybody in the organization. You have to have everybody. You can't make exceptions to people that say, okay, that guy brought in a ton of money or that woman brought in a ton of money, so they get a pass on this. That doesn't matter. Everybody has to be held accountable and everybody has to be measured in a consistent way. So part of the challenge here and the best practices, regulators have started on this, and you can see this in a lot of the consent orders, but bankers are also, and Tanya, like she just walked through, trying to figure out how to measure this, how to dimension. How do you take a non-financial risk and make it quantitative in some way? So there are metrics out there. There's ways to try to identify smoke, to see if that needs further investigation. There's ways to identify good behavior. So all of that really needs to be formalized and brought together in a consistent framework where you can evaluate employees, not allow people to get away with stuff, but at the same time, be very consistent in how you think about that. So I think a lot of that is just figuring out how to pull the performance measurement aspect together. And I think the industry's made a lot of progress in that, but it has a long way to go. I mean, this is, you're trying to quantify something that's non-quantifiable. It's touchy-feely at times. So you're trying to use whatever tools are available to inform you in some way. And you want to be informed both on the positive and the negative side.
Thanks.
Hey, Penny, if I could bookend on this one real quick. I know we talk about measurement. You know, one exercise that I've done historically is I talk to my first line, either risk or compliance leads, or if you have an ethical lead in the first line. And what we do is we classify their entire leadership pool anonymously into, are they a supporter of ethical culture and conduct or a detractor? And are they an active or passive? So you end up being either in one of the quadrants, if you think about a quadrant map, right? The one side is passive to active. The other one is detractor supporter. We define what it means to be in each quadrant. The goal is to get everyone into the active supporter quadrant from a business testimonial perspective. But when you do this exercise, you find out you have influencers on all elements in each quadrant. And our goal is to figure out how to move them one quadrant at a time till ultimately they're active supporters, right? And if those who are active detractors, right, those are the ones we go after first because they're doing things overtly contra culture.
Right.
Hey, Penny, can I come back in here? So I'm going to go back to a bookend and a bookend and a bookend. Okay, so on top of that just reminds me of a story. I was in a one-on-one meeting with the CEO of a very large company, one of these regular meetings I would have, and and he was talking about an individual they were thinking about hiring. Oftentimes, as a regulator, say, "Do you have any issues? What do you think about this person?" And so he was telling me that somebody told him that this individual was pretty honest. And he stopped and he froze and he looked at me, he goes, "How can you be pretty honest? You're either honest or you're not, right? There's no degree of honesty. You're either honest or not." So he wouldn't take that person on because there was apparently a little question mark on part of that person's honesty. So just a little war story on that one.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love it. I'm going to go to the big C discussion, right? Culture, right? And, you know, we talked about how one person can put a whole organization at jeopardy by one person's poor behavior. So I'm going to turn this to you, Tanya, to start the discussion on how does culture impact behavior?
Right. So, you know, look, I think I touched upon it. It really is a symbiotic relationship. One feeds the other. A positive culture, positive behaviors, I think, as this whole panel has said, really is a key mitigant to conduct risk, right? And so poor behavior leads to higher conduct risk. So you really can't have one without the other. And it really is foundational, I think, to firms to build out conduct risk programs, knowing that a you know, whether it's a bank or another company has, you know, clear purpose, has a strategy, sets out clear behavioral expectations of their employees and have it be seen end to end. So I think Spiro mentioned in terms of performance management, you know, people shouldn't just be judged on what they bring to the table, but how do they bring it to the table, right? So goals and you know, I think we've seen over the years how performance management has changed, and it's more of a balanced approach, right? And I think everybody on this panel has been talking about there's the qualitative elements and then the quantitative elements that you need to bring together. So culturally, you know, what are those positive behaviors that drive people? So, you know, we've seen a lot of firms across the industry really set behavioral expectations, trust is very big, right? Trust and conduct and culture. I mean, they all are terms and words that you hear quite often when we're speaking about conduct risk. You know, there's things like transparency, accountability, partnership, stakeholder management. You know, those are all behavioral, I would think, expectations that firms would set for their employees to, you know, permeate a positive culture from within. And I think everybody's talked about tone from the top, echo, you know, and how it how conduct is really everyone's issue. So it's top down and bottoms up and sideways in every which way. It really all flows together.
Thank you. So Tom, how do you make culture real so that it can impact behavior? Tom?
I guess it's about taking each small step sometimes. I mean, the thing about culture is we tend to talk about it as this huge amorphous sort of concept. You know, culture drives sort of conduct drives culture. I mean, yeah, Tanya sort of put it very well. But fundamentally, it's just about doing each action right. And, you know, Spiro's honesty point, it comes out there as well. So I think sometimes it's just helping people to understand that those little actions add up to a big one. And an example one of my colleagues always uses from where he used to work was that a trader was fired for routinely taking an extra piece of bacon for breakfast. So he paid for 2 and he took 3. Now, you know, this is a trader in a very big bank who was paid, I don't know how much, but I'm sure more than I can imagine. And he was, you know, effectively defrauding the bank of, I don't know, 20 cents worth of bacon every day. It adds up to a few dollars. On one side, you go, that's insane, you know, to be fired for a few dollars. The other side, you go, you're insane. You risked your job for a few dollars. And I think that's a good example of how, you know, both how little actions can really sort of drive much greater sort of issues. And we've talked about the sort of reputational side. There's a good example, not of the reputation of the bank, but the reputation of the individual, but also how it sort of cascades upwards. You know, if that hadn't been stopped, and if it had been routinely known that you could just do that, other people will follow. You'll then end up with, right, it's fine to just casually defraud your employer of a few dollars every year. Suddenly you've got a culture where doing the wrong thing is fine. Not necessarily incentivized, but fine. And that then continues. And that's why, you know, in this bank, they did fire him for it. However small it sounds and however in some ways little it feels, it was seen as, no, this is a fundamental honesty problem. And again, you know, regulators insist on honesty in the employees of any firm. You know, the UK, anyone at that level has to be certified as fit and proper by the firm. So, you know, the firm is putting its own reputation effectively behind the honesty of each and every individual who is being certified. And that's any trader. So you've got these sort of layers of control that tries to drive just doing the right thing. But then you just sit there going, it's not actually that difficult, is it? You just remember, you know, the lesson your father gave you in the cab or the pharmacy, and you go, actually, I'll just buy the bit of bacon. It's not going to be hard.
So are you suggesting there's a direct line between bacon and embezzlement? I love that story. It's not good for his cholesterol either, just saying. To eat the extra bacon. Due to time, why don't we move on to the next question, which is current events, right? There have been a number of large events that have impacted the management of conduct risk. I can think of about 5 of them off the top of my head. So I'm going to start with you, Tom, back to you. And maybe you have more bacon to add to the story, about management of conduct risk and what major events can we learn from? And then I'm going to turn it to each of the panelists as well after you.
Well, I suppose it would be impossible to start talking about current events without basically talking about the COVID environment that we're all living in. And certainly both that, and then, recent presidential elections, Brexit, all of these have contributed to economic uncertainty and to changes in employee ways of working. So, those are huge events that are affecting every single one of us, now, because we're sitting here in our homes doing a panel as opposed to sort of in person or sitting on the same podium. And I guess those drivers have affected us hugely. You've got changes to the types of conduct risk that may be arising. It's harder to spot them, and they are themselves probably changing. It's much harder for management to maintain oversight of conduct risk exposures day to day. And there's going to be a change in the probability of conduct issues occurring as well. So, some conduct risk may be less likely. You probably are less likely to be worrying at the moment about sexual harassment on the trading floor. But at the same time, you are potentially more likely to be worrying about traders thinking they can get away with insider dealing. Remote working basically means that you've got day-to-day business activities being undertaken at home with limited oversight. That's the reality of it. And that even if you have identified the conduct risks that come out of that, which by now I think most firms have, they're a lot harder to monitor and manage. We've got technology that has been set up for firms to have in offices, not in homes. And you've got employee behaviors that are changing. So, it used to be that seeing consistently someone trading at 2 a.m. was seen as a red flag. That's because we saw various big events 10 years ago, which had that as a pattern of behavior. Now it could just mean that they're yet another poor parent who is desperately trying to look after their children during the day and doing their actual day job during the evening. These things have changed. And I think similarly, the way that firms are trying to monitor conduct risks is changing, but that's creating their own risks in itself. So, conduct risks emerge from working from home, but they're also emerging from the way we try to monitor. I actually remember seeing at the beginning of the crisis, one of the sort of technology consulting firms was trying to sell a product that would watch people through their laptop camera and tell their manager when they left. So that, effectively the same oversight you'd get by just sitting next to each other at a desk. When someone's gone off and if they come back to their laptop or if they don't. But the firms, as far as I'm aware, all pushed back and said, no, we're not getting this, because they took the view that a manager should not be able to see out of the laptop camera, especially when all the junior staff are sitting potentially in their bedrooms. So, you had all sorts of other cultural issues being created by that concept. That in itself was both trying to mitigate a risk and was creating one. And I think it's just because these current events were hitting us so hard and fast that we couldn't necessarily keep up with what the impact was.
Thanks, thank you. So Tanya, anything you want to add on current events?
Sure. Well, so topical, right, is COVID and new ways of working. So I think, to Tom's point, firms are fully engaged in those two topics. And again, putting a conduct risk lens on the impacts of COVID, it's really interesting to see conduct breaches and being able to, take those breaches, organize them to the different types of issues that you would find that impact the bank, the client, the market, the employee, and how the trends have changed, right? So when you're talking about data privacy, right? So, it's funny that, when you're working from home, you would think data privacy breaches would skyrocket, but the lack of being able to monitor them, right? You're seeing sometimes trends going down, for example. So like cases where you would think one trigger would escalate and rise, it actually is decreasing. So really I think trying to focus on what are those escalated risks in this new environment that we're in, right? And data, and that's been huge, right? Cyber risk, data privacy, um, information sharing, confidentiality, like all of these issues, which have always been part of conduct, but are now reprioritized, right? So you saw the volatility in the markets in March. So how does that impact personal account trading violations, right? So we're really, I think the industry is trying to reorganize or reprioritize the risks based on, the current environment. At least, that's what I'm trying to do.
Thanks. Okay, so why don't we go to Spiro next?
This reminds me of when I first met you. We would sit around the table with a group of industry experts and analyze case studies of
Yes.
what's going on and what we can learn from them, right? And you always want to make sure these external events are learning points, and you bring opportunities back to your organization. And I think from studying those events over the years, one of the things that I've personally identified is that culture means a lot when there's an individual conduct case. Okay, so for example, you could have a culture where the ends justifies the means, right? And then when you have conduct cases, it's systemic, right? And you've got bigger problems to deal with from a regulatory perspective. But if you have a culture where the means outweighs the ends, right? Individual cases can be explained away as anomalous, right? And that's part of the reputation that you garner with regulators over time, and based on your history of dealing with individual small cases. I thought we said smoke earlier. I love that. How you deal with the smoke in your organization. I used to talk about, is it the last straw? But now, because of Tom, I'm going to say that's the last piece of bacon we're willing to deal with on that one, right? But you have to set up tolerance levels for what is the last piece of bacon you're willing to tolerate that for, because obviously that person was doing it for a period of time and they didn't excuse him the first time, right? And the more you create that culture, now, the more positive you create as a culture, what I also found is where these negative events happen, subcultures existed in an organization, right? So you need to do your best to weed out subcultures. And sometimes that subculture is because that individual that leads it, we talked about this earlier, is so powerful, right? Makes so much money that it's hard to correct them, and everyone in their area is untouchable, right? That can never be the case. So FINRA put out 8 questions when they were doing brokerage reviews. And one of their questions focused on, have you rooted out every subculture that exists, right? That's acting contra culture to the expected culture of the organization. And how are you using back to your performance management, your incentive management, and your disciplinary committee to deal with all of that?
Well, that's really helpful. My class just did a case study around the London whale, and I think there was a subculture going on in that particular department where all the losses occurred. So that's really interesting. And then there's another big bank that had a big sales practice event, and part of the issue was they didn't look across the bank to see if it was systemic. They kind of weeded out little spots here and there where there were problems. So that's actually really helpful. Thank you. So I'm going to move to, I think, the last question, and then we'll take questions. And the last question is, we, as being part of the Columbia community, I wanted to address if we have students that are listening today that are interested in a career in conduct risk, what related fields of study would you recommend that they sign up for? And do you have any advice for someone who's entering the job market today and wants to pursue a career in conduct risk? And I don't know, maybe I'll start with you, Tanya, and then go around.
That's interesting because, you know, conduct risk, and I think that the term really didn't arise till, you know, maybe 2015, 2016. So careers specifically in conduct risk, I think that's a tough one. You know, I think conduct risk today in organizations sit in operational risk areas. You find them in compliance areas, and you find them in HR, employee relation areas. So, you know, thinking about the types of skill sets, behavioral science, having PhDs now in neuropsych and psychology, and behavioral sciences is you know, something that I think is where people are tending to go in this space. Personally, I have a, you know, my background is in operational risk compliance, building out, you know, methodologies and risk assessments, and I have a background in finance and banking, and it somehow led me into this space, but it was, I think, more of a I fell into it versus, you know, looking for a specific career in conduct risk per se.
And you're a Columbia graduate, correct?
Yes, this was very much reminding me of back in the day. It was very exciting.
Thank you. Scott?
Sure, I'd offer up a couple of points and echo what Tanya just mentioned in that conduct risk, getting a career in conduct risk. It's really only recently where conduct and conduct risk and behavioral psychology has really become important. It's always been important because you've always, when you're dealing with finance, you're dealing with money, and you're dealing with people who, if there is a short change in their personal behavior, or if there's a demand or something, a need for money, when you're dealing with money, there's always that risk that you're going to do or be tempted by something like that. So that has always been there in banking. It's always been there. And you can see that to Tom's earlier point on the last question, even in the U.S. here, where we have the CARES Act and the PPP and all this distribution of $600+ billion worth of money in a very rapid amount of time. That really poses a lot of risk to the system, and it challenges people who might be compromised or might be compromisable to be able to look into that. So I think there are challenges. The risk of adverse behavior is really increasing all the time. So I do think the banks are beginning to think about designating a conduct risk, a conduct oversight officer, be that a full-time job or a part-time job. But I think that is going to become more prevalent as we move forward. But I would say I like the behavioral science things, I like psychology on that. But I really do think this is a blend of quantitative and qualitative components. There is the qualitative, how do you people behave? And it comes back to Spiro's earlier comments with respect to culture. If you have a strong culture, if you have a strong set of norms, strong set of beliefs in the company, and that people do that, then if you work in it and then you're in a rapidly changing work from home environment, then suddenly you're shifted out there. If you have established that and that works, you're probably less susceptible to it. So I think that culture is part of it, and maintaining and building that culture. But at the same time, I think the industry is thinking about using different metrics, and going back to the smoke analogy, different metrics, different measures to try to sniff out where there might be something going wrong. And you can start, a lot of that would come down, you mentioned the sales practice, a lot of that might come down to customer complaints, and where customers might complain about this. Do you understand why they're complaining? Is there something behind it? Is there a common person or a common department behind that? You could have employee complaints similarly, where an employee, a whistleblower might voice an objection to that. You might have certain error rates that go through the GL. So there's certain things that are quantitative and can be mined. Social media is another one. There's certain things that can be mined, and you combine that with kind of the social aspect. And I think you're actually, you're creating a new job description, I think. So I do think this is evolving, and I do think it'll become more and more prevalent as we move forward.
Cool, thank you. How about Spiro?
So I agree, very new field in terms of a discrete position. But in the past, we handled this through other different forums, right? But if you eventually want to be an ethics officer or a conduct officer, starting a career in compliance or anti-fraud, operational risk, enterprise risk, Sarbanes-Oxley, internal audit, investigations, legal, or joining a regulator and being part of a regulatory organization, right, are all good starting points to get you on a path into that career. You can show elements of your experiences from any of those jobs that can bring you into an ethics organization, ultimately become an ethics officer. And then I'll offer up the Risk Management Association has a Principles of Ethical Conduct. If you search for that, you can also make the pledge to act ethically, which I'll promote. That's out there. I was part of the group that put that out there. And I will tell you, that's an area where employers are starting to look, say, who made the pledge? Right? Who's pledging to act in this way, right? So, and then Scott has it spot on. Once you're in one of these positions, you need to be the exemplary model, all right, for best practices in terms of conduct, which means like, even if it's allowable, you know, when I'm in a situation where someone has to pay, right, you know, for a meal, I find out, you know, I put it on my personal card, right? Because at the end of the day, I would rather pick up a $200 dinner and not have my career at risk, right? So people see when you do that, and you become a beacon for your organization, and people know that you're the heartbeat that they want to put into an ethics officer role.
And you're not going to have that extra slice of bacon if you didn't pay for it.
That's right. No extra slices of bacon. I don't, you know what? It would be too much for me anymore. My cholesterol is pretty high.
I know, mine too. So, Tom.
And I have a question for Tom. Was he a commodities trader by any chance? But
I don't actually know what exactly he was trading.
I know pork bellies is something that you could be trading, so I didn't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we've now said you need to have a PhD in data science, ethics, and behavioral psychology. So it's not a high bar, this one.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, I think I don't have anything really else to say. You know, all of the things we've put forward would help. But the one thing I would say, which has been touched on by everyone, I think, it's a new area on one level, but it's not a new area in reality. You know, we've always had to worry about ethics. We've always had to worry about doing the right thing. Conduct risk is the current way to put that. And I think we're doing better and better at monitoring it. We're doing better and better at promoting it. But, you know, fundamentally, these are old disciplines that we are doing better than we ever were before, I hope. But, you know, all the things that made people a CCO or a, you know, chief ethics officer are still going to be the case. You know, everyone has given you some great tools that might get you to that place.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And in some ways, it's following the trajectory of operational risk, which people for a long time called a new discipline, although I think we should be over that by now. But operational risk was always managed. It's just at a certain point, it became a more formal discipline with a framework, right, and practices, industry practices. Well, I think this was a great panel. I want to thank you guys on the panelists for really informative and substantive discussion. I want to thank everybody who sent in questions. The questions were fantastic. I think bacon has become my new metaphor for conduct risk, just saying. I'm already seeing it getting picked up in social media. so Tom, kudos to you for that one. And I think also I liked thinking about the idea that reputation takes a lifetime to build and like a second to destroy, right? And in summary, I mean, conduct risk, I think we all talked about it, is really about doing the right thing by your customers, Your employees are important. I know Spiro said number one, you know, think about them sometimes as number one, your stakeholders, and then of course your shareholders. Doing the right thing when nobody's watching, right? And paying close attention to an organization's culture. It's important to have a strong monitoring program. We talked about that. And to connect the dots, I think, between all the different information sources, right? So that you have an end-to-end view of the level of conduct risk that exists in an organization. We've always talked about tone from the top and tone from the middle and how incentive plans drive behavior. I really liked, you know, also thinking about echo from the bottom and then tone from within, which is really important. I think that gets at that idea that about doing the right thing when nobody's watching. Compensation, incentives, performance management play a critical role in managing conduct risk as well. So I want to just thank everybody. I think it was a great panel. I knew when I asked all of you that it would be a very lively discussion. And I'd like to wish you a good evening. And with that, I'd like to conclude this evening's event. So thank you, everybody.